The house was quiet when they entered, not the kind of quiet that comes from people sleeping or from a family away for the day. This was different. This was the kind of silence that feels unfinished. Lights were still on in some rooms. A television hummed to itself. Shoes sat near the doorway, exactly where someone had taken them off. Nothing appeared overturned. Nothing suggested urgency. And yet, no one answered when the door was called through. Police moved slowly, careful not to disturb what had already been disturbed. Each step echoed longer than it should have. The air felt heavy, as if it had been sealed inside the house for days. They found the family inside. Every room told the same quiet truth. No signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no obvious explanation that could be understood at a glance. The absence was complete. There were no voices, no movement, no indication that life had ended here in a way that made sense. Officers exited the house without speaking much to one another. Some looked back at the structure, as if expecting it to change. It did not. Within hours, the perimeter expanded. Local detectives stopped treating the scene as a routine investigation. Evidence logs grew thicker. Calls were made to agencies that are not contacted lightly. By the end of the first day, federal vehicles arrived. Unmarked, quiet, purposeful. They did not announce why they were there. Neighbors gathered behind police tape, searching for answers they were not given. Reporters asked questions that no one could yet answer. Officials used careful language, measured and restrained. Inside the house, time seemed frozen. Food remained where it had been left. Personal items sat untouched. Calendars showed plans that would never be kept. Investigators would later say this scene changed them forever. At first, the assumption was simple. Then it began to fracture. A timeline was assembled minute by minute. Who had been seen? Who had not? When lights were last noticed? When sounds were last heard? And then came the first contradiction. According to the timeline, someone should have noticed something, but no one did. According to the physical evidence, something significant had happened, but nothing explained how it began. There was no clear moment of interruption, no obvious point of entry, no immediate cause that could be agreed upon. The emotional weight of the discovery settled in slowly, not as shock, but as confusion, the kind that lingers. Investigators stepped back and looked again, at the placement of objects, at what was present, at what was missing, and then they noticed one detail. It was small, easy to overlook, almost ordinary, but it did not belong. That detail would remain unexplained for days. It would delay conclusions. It would force a reset of a timeline. And it would be the reason this case moved beyond the local level. For now, no names were released. No cause was confirmed. Only this was certain. An entire family was gone. The house remained. And something about what had been found inside did not align with anything investigators had seen before. The question was no longer what happened here. It was when, how, and why no one saw it coming. And the answer to that would take months to surface. Before the house became a scene, it was a home. It belonged to a family that followed patterns most people would recognize. Morning lights came on at roughly the same time each day. A car left the driveway, returned in the afternoon, and left again in the evening. Neighbors noticed this because it rarely changed. The adults in the household kept predictable schedules. Work days started early. Weekends were quieter. Errands were done in the morning, not late at night. Nothing about their routine drew attention. One member of the family was known for structure. Bills were paid on time. Appointments were written down. Doors were locked. Neighbors described this person as responsible, careful, and reserved. Another was remembered for warmth. Conversations lasted longer than expected. There was eye contact. There were questions about other people's lives. A presence that felt familiar, even to those who did not know them well. The children, when seen, appeared ordinary. School bags in the mornings. Quiet afternoons. Occasional laughter from the yard. Nothing that suggested distress or isolation. This was not a family known for arguments in public. No shouting that carried across property lines. No police visits that became neighborhood stories. No visible signs of instability. Neighbors described them as private but polite. The kind of family you notice only because they are always there. The kind you stop noticing because nothing ever seems wrong. Inside the home, routines were reinforced by habit. Meals followed patterns. Personal items stayed in familiar places. Evenings ended early during the week. Investigators later found notes, lists, reminders, small signs of planning that suggested future intent. There were upcoming appointments, events written weeks ahead, a routine that extended beyond the day they were last seen. Friends spoke of plans being made, holidays discussed, conversations that ended without finality. From the outside, the image was consistent, stable, contained, unremarkable. But private lives do not always mirror public ones. As investigators worked backward, they began to look for separation between what was visible and what was hidden. They reviewed phone records, financial habits, online activity. At first, nothing stood out. The family appeared careful with money. Communication was regular. There were no abrupt changes in behavior. Then came a pause. A single adjustment in routine surfaced. Small enough to be ignored, but unusual for this household. It occurred shortly before the final day. The change did not involve conflict. It did not involve outside contact. It did not raise concern on its own, but it did not fit. This required a reset of the timeline. Investigators went back again, earlier, slower. As they did, the emotional tone shifted, not toward alarm, but toward uncertainty. Because the family that seemed consistent, organized, and forward-looking had also done something that suggested hesitation. Something that suggested interruption. Not enough to alarm anyone at the time, but enough to challenge the idea that everything was as it appeared. The question became quiet but persistent. If nothing was wrong, why had one routine changed? That question would remain unanswered as the investigation moved forward. The final day did not begin with urgency. Morning arrived the way it always had. At least, that is how it appeared at first. Lights were turned on inside the house. A vehicle left the driveway. Another remained parked exactly where it usually sat. Nothing drew attention from those nearby. According to records later reviewed, routine actions took place. Devices connected to local networks. Messages were sent. Applications were opened and closed. There was no call for help, no message expressing fear, no signal that something had already gone wrong. Investigators would later reconstruct this day minute by minute. They would examine timestamps that most people never think about. They would rely on small digital markers to understand a larger absence. One family member was confirmed to be active earlier than usual. Another appeared to delay a routine task. At the time, these details meant nothing. To neighbors, the day passed quietly. No raised voices. No unfamiliar vehicles lingering. No sudden departures. Midday came and went. What should have followed was another ordinary afternoon. School pickups, work returns, evening preparations. But the pattern began to loosen. One expected movement did not occur. A car did not return when it normally did. A routine interaction never happened. Still, no one intervened. There was no reason to. As evening approached, the house remained quiet. Lights stayed on in rooms that were usually dark at that hour. A television remained active longer than expected. From the outside, this could be explained away. People run late. Plans change. Schedules shift. Investigators would later note that this was the first moment when the timeline began to stretch. According to one data source, activity continued inside the home. According to another, it should have stopped. This created the first clear contradiction. If the family was together, why did the data suggest separation? If they were following routine, why did certain habits pause? There was no immediate answer. Late evening passed without incident. No calls were placed to emergency services. No neighbors reported unusual sounds. At some point during the night, the house settled into stillness. Not the kind associated with rest, the kind that follows an ending. Investigators could not determine the exact moment this happened. That uncertainty would remain central to the case. When morning came, nothing changed on the outside. The house looked the same. The street sounded the same. But something that should have occurred did not. A routine message was never sent. A scheduled action never took place. A connection went silent. This absence prompted concern hours later, not immediately. Concern grew slowly, passed between people who knew the family well enough to notice a break in pattern. By the time authorities were contacted, the last normal day was already over. In the investigation that followed, this day would be revisited again and again. Each pass through the timeline added detail. Each revision removed certainty. The emotional tone of the case shifted here, from shock to unease, from reaction to analysis. Because what investigators were seeing did not point to a single moment of chaos. It pointed to a gradual withdrawal from routine. And that raised a difficult question. If there was no disruption, no external interruption, and no visible distress, what caused the day to end the way it did? That question would remain unresolved as the investigation moved forward, forcing another reset of the timeline and a deeper examination of what had been overlooked. The concern did not begin with panic. It began with absence. A message went unanswered. Then another. A routine check-in failed to happen. At first, it was dismissed as delay, then as inconvenience. Only later did it become something else. By the time the call was placed, hours had already passed beyond what anyone considered normal. Authorities arrived without urgency, guided only by request for a welfare check. From the outside, the house gave nothing away. No damage, no open doors, no visible signs that anything inside required immediate intervention. An officer knocked, waited, knocked again. There was no response. Entry was made according to procedure. Careful, measured. The first room appeared unchanged. Furniture remained in place. Personal belongings were where they were expected to be. Then the silence began to feel different. Each additional step into the house narrowed the possibilities. Each room removed one more explanation. The discovery unfolded without drama. No sudden movement, no raised voices, just the quiet confirmation that the family was there and unresponsive. The officer exited the house and called for assistance. Not loudly, not urgently, but with a tone that signaled this was no longer a routine visit. As more responders arrived, the structure of the investigation shifted. The house was secured. Movement was restricted. Observation replaced assumption. Those inside did not rush. They took note of details that might otherwise be overlooked. Lights left on, shoes by the entrance, objects placed as if someone expected to return to them. There were no signs of forced entry, no visible damage, no clear explanation that could be communicated in a sentence. This absence of disruption created its own problem, because if no one had forced their way in, then someone had been allowed inside, or no one had entered at all. That contradiction surfaced quickly. The initial assessment suggested a single event, but the environment suggested continuity. Food had been left out, but not spoiled. Devices were powered on, but inactive. Clocks continued to mark time without interruption. Investigators began to realize that the moment they were searching for was not obvious. There was no single point where everything changed. As daylight faded, the emotional tone shifted again. What began as concern hardened into gravity. Supervisors were notified. Specialized units were requested. By nightfall, the perimeter had expanded beyond what neighbors had ever seen on that street. Vehicles arrived without markings. Personnel moved with purpose, but spoke little. The decision to involve federal authorities was made quietly. There was no announcement, no public explanation. Inside the house, documentation continued. Photographs, measurements, observations recorded with precision. And then, during this process, one detail drew attention. It was not dramatic. It did not immediately explain anything, but it did not belong in the sequence investigators had constructed. Its presence suggested timing that conflicted with everything else. It implied an action that should have left other traces, but had not. This forced a pause. The working theory was set aside. The timeline was cleared. Investigators began again, earlier, slower, with fewer assumptions, because whatever had happened inside this house did not fit the order they expected. And the more carefully they looked, the more that order dissolved. By the end of the night, one conclusion was shared quietly among those involved. This case could not be understood by what was visible alone. Something important had occurred without leaving the kind of evidence they were used to seeing. And until that contradiction could be explained, the most basic question remained unanswered. When did this truly begin? That question would follow the investigation into its next phase, where answers would become more difficult, not less. In the first hours after the house was secured, investigators needed a working explanation, not a conclusion, something provisional, something that could organize evidence and guide questions. The earliest assumption focused outward. If an entire family was gone, the simplest explanation was intrusion. Someone from outside, someone unknown, someone who entered, acted, and left. This theory aligned with experience. It was familiar. It allowed the investigation to move forward without delay. Officers canvassed the neighborhood. They asked about unfamiliar vehicles, unrecognized faces, anything out of place during the days leading up to the discovery. The answers were consistent. No one had seen strangers lingering. No one heard disturbances. No one recalled unusual movement near the house. Cameras from nearby properties were reviewed. Footage showed cars passing at regular intervals, people walking dogs, children riding bicycles. Nothing pointed toward an external presence. Still, the theory remained in place. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Investigators turned inward, back to the house. They searched for signs of forced entry, damaged locks, broken windows, disrupted frames. There were none. Doors were intact. Windows were secured. Alarm systems, where present, had not been triggered. This did not eliminate intrusion, but it complicated it. The next adjustment to the theory involved timing. If entry had occurred, it would have required access. Either the door had been opened willingly, or it had not been forced at all. That possibility raised questions about familiarity. Had someone known the family? Had someone been expected? Friends, co-workers, and extended contacts were identified. Interviews began. Those conversations followed a pattern. No one described conflict. No one mentioned threats. No one recalled recent fear or concern. The public image remained stable. As the day progressed, pressure increased. From media, from community leaders, from within the department itself. There was an expectation of clarity. But clarity did not arrive. The initial theory began to strain under the weight of detail. If an outsider had entered, why was there no sign of resistance? If the family had been surprised, why did the environment remain undisturbed? If the event had occurred quickly, why did the timeline suggest duration? These questions did not dismantle the theory all at once. They weakened it gradually. By the second day, investigators attempted to refine rather than replace it. They considered targeted intrusion, someone with intent, someone who planned. This accounted for the lack of chaos. It explained restraint, but it introduced another contradiction. A planned act usually leaves preparation behind. Surveillance, communication, movement. None of that had surfaced. Financial records were reviewed. No unusual withdrawals. No sudden changes. No signs of leverage. Digital communication showed nothing alarming. No threats. No warnings. No escalation. The emotional tone inside the investigation shifted again, from determination to restraint. Because the more carefully evidence was handled, the less it supported the original assumption. Late in the review process, one analyst raised a quiet concern. If the event did not begin from outside, then the timeline had to be reconsidered. Not adjusted, reconsidered entirely. The focus shifted from who entered to who was already there. This did not imply guilt. It implied proximity. Investigators returned to the timeline of the final day. They re-examined the order of movements, the sequence of device activity, the points where routine paused. This reset changed the shape of the case. What once appeared as a single moment now appeared as a span of time. What seemed immediate now appeared extended. And within that span, one assumption no longer held. The family may not have experienced the event together. This possibility introduced a new layer of complexity. It suggested separation within closeness, overlap without simultaneity. That idea remained unspoken outside the investigative team. It was too early, too uncertain, but it altered how evidence was viewed. By the end of this phase, the first theory had not been disproven. It had simply stopped explaining enough. And when a theory loses its ability to explain, it no longer leads an investigation. It becomes a placeholder. The case moved forward without one. What replaced it was not another answer, but a deeper question. If no one forced their way in, and no one left behind a clear trace, where did this begin? That question marked the end of the first phase of the investigation and the beginning of a more difficult one. The investigation slowed before it accelerated. When a case stops yielding simple answers, attention shifts to the margins. Small inconsistencies, minor gaps, details that were once dismissed as incidental. Investigators returned to the house with fresh eyes, not to confirm what they already believed, but to test what they might have missed. They compared room to room, not for damage, but for order. What had been touched, what had not. One room suggested activity later than expected. Another appeared untouched beyond a certain hour. These differences were subtle, but they mattered. The timeline was adjusted again. This time, it did not align with the assumption that the family had remained together throughout the event. If they had, patterns would match. They did not. Device records were re-examined. Background activity, connection logs, moments when systems went quiet. One device stopped responding earlier than the others. Another remained active longer than it should have. At first, this was attributed to technical variation. Then it was compared against behavior history. The pattern did not match. Investigators consulted specialists, not to confirm cause, but to rule out error. The conclusion was restrained, but clear. The discrepancy was real. This introduced a new contradiction. If the family was together, their digital footprints should converge. Instead, it separated. The emotional tone inside the investigative team shifted once more. Less certainty, more caution. The case was no longer moving toward an answer. It was moving away from assumptions. Attention turned to interactions inside the household. Not arguments, not disputes, but sequence. Who was last active? Who went quiet first? Who remained engaged after others did not? This required another reset of the timeline. The original starting point was abandoned. A new one was established earlier in the day. From there, events were rebuilt carefully, minute by minute, without interpretation. The result was uncomfortable. The evidence suggested separation within the same space, different endpoints, overlapping periods of awareness. This did not explain motive. It did not assign responsibility, but it challenged the idea of a single shared moment. As these findings accumulated, the scope of the case changed. Local investigators recognized limits, not of effort, but of specialization. The decision to escalate was discussed quietly, then acted upon. Federal agents were briefed, not with conclusions, but with contradictions. They listened, asked few questions, requested access to materials that had already been reviewed. Their involvement did not bring immediate clarity. It brought structure. Behavioral analysis was introduced, not to speculate, but to understand sequence and control. They focused on order rather than action. on timing rather than outcome. One agent noted something that had been present from the beginning, but overlooked. The house showed no signs of interruption from outside, but it also showed no signs of urgency inside. That combination was rare. It suggested that whatever occurred did not involve panic. At least, not at first. This observation did not solve the case. It narrowed it. The investigation paused again, not because there was nothing left to do, but because the next step required precision. Before proceeding, agents needed to agree on one thing. They needed to establish when the situation changed from routine to irreversible. That moment had not yet been identified, and without it, every conclusion remained provisional. The case stood at a threshold. Ahead lay answers that would require a different kind of examination, one that focused less on what was found and more on what was absent. The next phase would not move faster. It would move deeper. And with that shift came a realization that unsettled everyone involved. The most important part of this case may have happened quietly, long before anyone realized it had begun. By the second day, local authorities were reaching the limits of what they could determine on their own. The house remained as it had been found. Rooms were intact. Objects were in place. Yet the questions continued to grow, expanding faster than anyone could answer. Certain details demanded attention beyond routine law enforcement. The scale of absence, the clarity of order, the contradictions in timing, the subtle irregularities that suggested a sequence of events far more complex than initially understood. It was these elements, together, that triggered a call to federal authorities. The jurisdiction of the FBI is not invoked lightly. It requires factors that exceed local expertise, cases where the pattern, or lack thereof, signals an event outside normal criminal conduct. And here, those factors were present. Agents arrived quietly, without fanfare, without comment. They did not enter the house to observe spectacle. They entered to observe detail. Soon, the Behavioral Analysis Unit was called in. Their task is precise: to study behavior reflected in action or inaction, to interpret order in the absence of immediate clarity, to understand sequence, timing, and human response when conventional explanation fails. The investigative tone shifted immediately. It became slower, more deliberate. Each action inside the house was cataloged in layers, each layer compared against every known timeline. The questions became sharper. The conclusions were delayed. Assumptions were suspended. It is rare for the FBI to involve its behavioral unit at this stage. And when they do, investigators know the case has entered a different category entirely. The FBI doesn't get involved unless something is very wrong, one agent would later say. A statement measured, but heavy with implication. The presence of these experts changed the pace. Where local investigators had moved linearly, checking room by room, document by document, the federal team approached the scene as a whole. Patterns were reconstructed from beginning to end. Interruptions were identified in sequences previously considered continuous. Actions were re-evaluated for intent, timing, and possibility. Within hours, contradictions emerged that had been overlooked. Digital records that had once seemed consistent now clashed. Device activity suggested staggered moments of awareness among the family. Orders of movement contradicted the expected timeline. It became evident that the original understanding of the day had been incomplete. The emotional tone shifted, too, from professional concern to a deeper caution. Investigators, even those accustomed to difficult scenes, paused to acknowledge the unusual nature of the evidence. Quietly, they adjusted their assumptions. They reset the timeline, moving it back earlier in the day, revisiting interactions that had previously seemed routine. With a behavioral analysis unit involved, the case became both more focused and more complex. Every detail was re-examined, every movement reconsidered, and every assumption challenged. It became clear this investigation would not proceed as any typical case had before. Every step forward demanded precision, patience, and restraint. And every answer, however small, would reveal a new question. The house remained the same. Its silence was unchanged. Yet within that stillness, a new gravity had taken hold. One that signaled the investigation had entered a stage where facts alone would carry the weight, and where the absence of explanation was as important as the evidence that had been collected. And in that quiet, among carefully measured observations, one question hung in the air. If this level of attention is required, if the nation's top investigative experts are involved, then what had happened here that surpassed ordinary understanding? No one would answer that yet. Not fully. The timeline had shifted, the tone had deepened, and the House, unchanged, held its secret still. Once the federal team arrived, the investigation shifted into a methodical rhythm that had not existed before. It was no longer a matter of gathering facts in a linear sense. Each room, each object, each recorded movement was examined for relationship and sequence, for what it implied about intent and awareness. Investigators began to notice patterns that had been invisible to local responders. Small sequences repeated across rooms and spaces. Minor placements of personal items suggested order rather than interruption. The television remote in one location, a cup left precisely where it had been used, a chair slightly moved in one corner. Each detail carried weight when viewed together. Forensic psychologists were brought in to study the scene with care. They did not speculate on motive. They did not judge. Their task was to reconstruct human behavior from evidence left behind, to measure how action aligned or diverged from expectation. Through their analysis, one theme became apparent. The household had been disturbed, yes, but not randomly. The sequence suggested intention. It suggested timing. It suggested the deliberate placement of objects in a manner that carried meaning, even if that meaning was not yet understood. Yet contradictions appeared quickly. Some items, clearly used, were left as if the user had intended to return. Others were abandoned without explanation. Certain devices had been activated and then left inactive at unexpected intervals. The timeline of action was uneven, almost as though multiple narratives were overlapping in the same space. The investigators paused repeatedly. Each discovery required a reset of assumptions. Every pattern noted introduced questions about what had happened before, what had been anticipated, and what had been interrupted. The emotional tone of the team changed as well. A quiet seriousness replaced initial curiosity. The evidence suggested control in some moments and disarray in others. It suggested that whatever occurred had been planned in part, but also that unexpected events had intervened. Investigators mapped the day once more. Minute by minute, room by room. They overlaid observations with witness statements, communication logs, and digital timestamps. A controlled revelation emerged from this process. Some actions were clearly deliberate. Others appeared reactive, almost spontaneous. The line between premeditation and chaos was being traced, but not crossed. Investigators knew that every conclusion must be provisional. Every pattern noted could be explained differently with the introduction of new information. Even at this stage, the house remained quiet, still, imposing in its silence. The investigators were left with one certainty. The evidence carried meaning, but that meaning was layered. It required patience, careful observation, and repeated examination. And yet, as they cataloged the behaviors and movements, a new contradiction appeared. Some sequences suggested the family had been moving together at certain points, while other indicators implied separation. A timeline reset became necessary once again. The sequence of actions had to be re-examined from an earlier starting point, moving forward with precision and attention to each detail. The shift in investigative tone was now unmistakable. The local perspective, linear surface level, had been replaced by one that probed depth, nuance, and inference. One agent paused, reviewing photographs of a single room. They noted a detail that had been recorded days before, but had never seemed relevant. Its placement suggested a careful decision, yet it contradicted other observations. At that moment, the team collectively understood something subtle but crucial. The events inside this house had followed some form of order. They were neither entirely spontaneous nor entirely planned. The evidence suggested a controlled pattern with interruptions, small but significant, interwoven into it. The final truth remained beyond reach. Every sequence, every pattern, every small discovery hinted at complexity. Yet for now, the house held its secrets, and the investigators could only trace the outlines of what had occurred without fully revealing it. The narrative had shifted. The investigation had gained depth, and the quiet persistence of the scene hinted that the most important details were still hidden, waiting for careful, measured reconstruction. A single observation, subtle but inconsistent with the rest, lingered in the mind of the team. If some sequences had been deliberate and others interrupted, then the sequence of events might never be fully understood, unless every small detail was followed to its logical conclusion. The timeline was reset once more, and the house waited. The longer the investigation continued, the more the original assumptions began to strain. Each room, each object, each digital timestamp had been scrutinized multiple times. Yet the answers remained incomplete, and a quiet tension began to emerge within the team. It was during one of these methodical reviews that a darker theory began to take shape. Not speculative, but grounded in the patterns already observed. Something within the sequence of events suggested that the source of disruption had not come entirely from outside the home. That perhaps someone close to the family had knowledge, access, or influence that made the outcome possible. At first, the idea was approached cautiously. An insider theory is delicate. It risks assumption and accusation, and so every detail was verified, every sequence tested against known behavior. Investigators revisited visitors, contacts, and those with daily proximity to the household. Even seemingly minor interactions were recorded and compared against the timeline. Behavioral analysts noted several red flags: small deviations from routine, unexpected interactions in the days leading up to the final events, actions that in isolation seemed ordinary, but taken together formed a pattern inconsistent with prior behavior. One particular sequence stood out. Access points that should have required entry without authorization had been used. Items moved slightly from their usual positions. Devices activated or left dormant at irregular times. These were not errors or accidents. They suggested knowledge of the environment, of habits, of the family's predictable movements. The emotional tone among investigators shifted. Careful observation gave way to a sense of calculation, not fear, not alarm, but an awareness that the circumstances were deliberate, organized in some way that had eluded initial review. The timeline was reset again. Investigators moved earlier into the day, reconstructing actions to capture nuance and overlap. Digital logs, communications, and physical movements were reanalyzed with a focus on sequence rather than assumption. It became clear that the event had layers. Some actions were reactive, made under pressure. Others were deliberate, executed with intent and forethought. The evidence pointed toward the presence of planning, the kind that could only occur when someone understood the household intimately, when the sequence of events had been anticipated in part. A contradiction arose in reviewing the pattern of interactions. Some moments suggested hesitation. Others suggested preparation. This tension between movement and stillness, between ordinary routine and interruption, became the defining feature of the case. As analysts traced each step backward, the theory of insider involvement strengthened. It did not identify a person immediately. It did not assign responsibility without corroboration, but it reframed the entire narrative. The investigation now considered intent rather than impulse. Each action, each pause, each decision was reinterpreted through the lens of calculation. It was no longer a matter of chaos overtaking a household. It was a sequence in which knowledge, timing, and foresight had played a decisive role. By the end of this phase, the case had transformed in the eyes of the team. No longer was it an isolated tragedy that could be explained through chance or misfortune. It was a complex sequence, informed by preparation, executed with purpose, and shaped by proximity. And in that realization, a quiet, unspoken understanding emerged. Whatever had occurred, it had been guided by intention. The final truth had not yet been revealed. But every subsequent step in the investigation would be measured against the possibility that this event had been designed rather than accidental. The house remained still. The sequence of actions, paused and recorded, waited, and the evidence hinted that the story within it was deliberate, controlled, and purposeful, a pattern of intent rather than impulse. By the time the investigation had reached its fourth week, the rhythm of analysis had changed. The initial shock had passed. The methodical reconstruction of the timeline, the repeated examination of devices, objects, and movement had settled into a pattern that was rigorous and precise. Yet even within this structure, uncertainty remained. Federal agents, having reviewed every sequence, every interaction, every subtle detail in the household, began to see the contours of an event far more complex than anyone had imagined. They returned to the house one morning, carefully, deliberately, moving through rooms with measured attention. Every surface, every item was documented again. Every discrepancy, every subtle contradiction was compared to the reconstructed timeline. Then it was noticed. A finding small in size but profound in implication emerged from a space that had been revisited countless times. It had been overlooked before, dismissed perhaps because it appeared ordinary. But in the context of the newly reconstructed sequence, it carried weight that altered everything investigators thought they understood. Agents described the discovery in careful terms, but the psychological impact was immediate. It was not the kind of shock that comes from visible destruction or violence. It was the weight of understanding, the realization that events had unfolded in a way that suggested a depth of planning, awareness, and control that had been hidden within the ordinary. Every subsequent action was seen in a new light. Interactions that had once seemed normal now hinted at intention. Pauses and delays, previously attributed to routine or chance, now carried significance. Moments that had been overlooked were reconsidered. Patterns emerged where once there had been ambiguity. The contradiction that had surfaced earlier regarding the separation of movements within the household became central to this understanding. The finding confirmed that the sequence of events had been guided, deliberate in part, and that certain actions had been intended to unfold in specific ways, at specific times. It was a form of order imposed within disorder, a structure that carried purpose. For investigators, the emotional shift was profound, not from fear, not from spectacle, but from comprehension. To recognize that these moments were deliberate, that they had been orchestrated with knowledge and intent, was to confront the weight of what had occurred in a way that purely physical evidence could not convey. This discovery reframed every element of the case. The narrative of confusion and contradiction was replaced by one of controlled action. The timeline, once understood as a sequence of isolated events, was now recognized as a network of interdependent actions, each influencing the next. The family's routines, their presence, their interactions, all were reinterpreted. Investigators worked with restraint. The focus remained on understanding behavior, sequence, and consequence. There was no embellishment, no need for dramatization. The facts alone carried the emotional and investigative weight. The implications extended beyond individual actions. They touched the very structure of the investigation. Every earlier assumption about sequence, about movement, about separation, required reconsideration. The timeline had to be reset again, this time with the full gravity of the discovery in mind. And yet, even with this understanding, the ultimate truth remained partially hidden. The house remained quiet, unchanged in appearance, but every detail within it now had new significance. Every room, every item, every moment of stillness carried meaning. Investigators described this finding as traumatizing, not because of what could be seen, but because of what could be understood. The realization that deliberate intention had been woven through these final hours, that control and sequence had shaped outcomes, forced a confrontation with the scale and precision of what had occurred. For the first time, the investigation felt its weight fully. It was no longer a series of questions to be answered. It was a recognition of structure within tragedy, of order within absence, and of a sequence that had been guided by awareness and purpose. And as the agents stepped back from the scene, a quiet understanding settled in. The case would never be approached the same way again. Every detail collected, every contradiction noted, every timeline reconstructed. All of it had been recontextualized by a single, small discovery that revealed the depth of planning and the presence of control where chaos had once seemed absolute. The house remained silent, but its silence now spoke volumes. The discovery had transformed the investigation, elevated its gravity, and imposed a new framework for understanding what had occurred. And yet, even in this clarity, one essential truth persisted. The full extent of what had happened inside those walls, the final moments that led to the ultimate outcome, remained beyond reach. The agents and those following their work could only trace the patterns, measure the pauses, and infer the decisions that shaped the day. The timeline had shifted, the emotional tone had deepened, and the story itself was entering a phase where fact carried its own weight, unembellished, unaltered, and profoundly disturbing in its implications. After weeks of careful reconstruction, repeated timeline resets, and meticulous analysis, the investigation reached a point where the pattern became undeniable. The house, its objects, and the records of movement spoke clearly, though quietly, to the sequence of events that had led to the family's final day. The truth, once obscured by uncertainty and contradiction, could now be traced step by step. Investigators confirmed what had occurred. The absence that had haunted the initial review was now understood as the result of deliberate actions executed over a defined period. Each action aligned with behavioral patterns noted by the FBI and the Behavioral Analysis Unit, leaving a structured sequence rather than random chaos. The evidence suggested that moments of stillness, of inaction, had been deliberate and purposeful, part of a carefully considered plan rather than spontaneous reaction. Motive, long the subject of speculation, was clarified through documentation, communication records, and behavioral analysis. It was rooted in control, in the management of circumstances, and in the anticipation of outcomes. Not one sudden decision, but a series of calculated choices made with knowledge of the family's routines, habits, and environment. Every deviation from routine now carried weight, understood as a step toward the intended outcome rather than as coincidence. The sequence of events unfolded in a way that could be mapped precisely, minute by minute. Morning began with ordinary activity, undisturbed, almost ceremonial in its normalcy. Early interactions proceeded as expected. Devices activated, doors opened and closed, routines performed. Yet under this ordinary surface, the first deviations appeared. Small pauses, slight adjustments to objects, minor anomalies in digital activity. By mid-morning, the structure of action became apparent. Certain movements suggested awareness of surveillance and observation. Decisions were made in consideration of who might notice, what could be recorded, and how timing would influence response. The juxtaposition of control and inaction indicated that the unfolding events were intentional, measured, and synchronized with the household's existing patterns. Afternoon saw a further layering of action. Separations within the household, previously unexplained, aligned with the planned sequence. Actions that had seemed contradictory. Devices left active while others went dormant. Objects slightly moved. Schedules unexpectedly altered. Fit into a framework of coordination. The discrepancies were no longer anomalies. They were evidence of planning executed with precision. By early evening, the culmination became clear. The sequence of movement, pause, and final placement had followed a defined structure. The family's routines, once protective and stabilizing, had been intersected by a controlled series of interventions. Each step was intended, each moment accounted for, each pause meaningful. The emotional tone among investigators during this phase was sober and measured. No dramatization, no embellishment. The facts themselves carried gravity. It was clear that the case had never been a matter of random tragedy. It had been a calculated sequence, executed with knowledge, intent, and understanding of the environment. This understanding reframed every previous observation. Digital records, once confusing, now aligned. Room-by-room analyses, once contradictory, now confirmed the steps of a deliberate sequence. Behavioral indicators, once ambiguous, now suggested awareness, planning, and consideration. In conclusion, the full truth was reconstructed. The family's final hours were shaped by a series of deliberate actions designed to achieve a specific outcome. Each step, once obscured by apparent contradiction, now fit into a coherent narrative. The motive, rooted in control and foresight, had guided the sequence from beginning to end. The timeline, painstakingly reset multiple times, now stood firm. The house, its objects, and its silence bore witness to a controlled sequence executed with foresight. And while the emotional weight remained, it was the facts themselves, precise, sober, unembellished, that defined the conclusion. The story, once fragmented and unresolved, had been traced to its logical end. What remained was the reflection on the methodical unfolding of events, the human behavior documented within, and the enduring consequences of choices made with intent. The investigation was complete, and the truth, measured and factual, could finally be acknowledged. Weeks turned into months as the investigation moved from reconstruction to resolution. The initial shock, the repeated timeline resets, the meticulous cataloging of movement and behavior, had created a foundation from which authorities could act. The deliberate sequences, the contradictions clarified through analysis, and the patterns that indicated intent all converged into a body of evidence sufficient for legal proceedings. Arrests were made carefully, each step backed by documentation, witness statements, and corroborating records. Charges were filed. Those brought before the court were individuals connected to the household through proximity, knowledge, or access, their involvement shaped by the evidence collected over weeks of precise reconstruction. The arrests themselves were measured, procedural, and devoid of spectacle, reflecting the seriousness of what had occurred. Court proceedings followed a similar tone. Evidence was presented in structured sequences, timeline reconstructions, behavioral analysis, and recorded observations. Experts described the patterns, the sequence of action, and the implications of intent. The testimonies avoided exaggeration. They relied on fact. They conveyed the weight of deliberate action without dramatization. The outcomes varied depending on the level of involvement and the clarity of each individual's role. Some were convicted, held accountable under law, with sentences reflecting both responsibility and intent. Others remained under investigation or were cleared due to insufficient evidence. A few questions persisted unanswered and unresolved, as is sometimes inevitable in cases with complex timelines, overlapping actions, and behaviors that were measured and concealed. The investigation also prompted examination of institutional accountability. Local authorities and federal agencies reviewed procedures, access protocols, and response patterns. Recommendations were made for improving the tracking of households under complex surveillance conditions, for better coordination between local and federal units, and for enhanced communication in situations where timing and sequence are critical. These institutional lessons became part of the broader outcome, ensuring that future investigations would benefit from the clarity gained here. Emotionally, the closure was mixed. The families of victims received confirmation of accountability, yet the sense of loss remained. Investigators, particularly those in the behavioral analysis unit, reflected on the psychological weight of repeated exposure to carefully orchestrated events. The final resolution brought structure to the narrative, but the depth of human consequence could not be entirely measured. The timeline, finally stabilized, allowed the case to be archived with precision. The reconstruction of events, the confirmation of intent, and the identification of responsible parties created a framework for understanding. Yet the unanswered questions, the unresolved elements, remained quietly at the edges, a reminder of the complexity of human behavior and the limits of observation. In the end, the aftermath was defined by a combination of legal accountability and institutional reflection. The deliberate sequence that had caused so much disruption had been traced, analyzed, and addressed. Responsibility had been assigned. Systems had been reviewed, And the house, now empty, retained its silence. A witness to what had occurred. A marker of the sequence of events. A repository of the careful analysis that had finally provided closure. The case closed on paper. In practice, its lessons and its weight would continue to inform, to caution, and to guide those who follow in the meticulous work of uncovering truth in the face of complex human actions. The investigation had reached its conclusion, but its impact on individuals, institutions, and the understanding of deliberate sequences within human behavior would endure far longer. As the case reached its conclusion, investigators and analysts began to reflect on a question that had been present from the very beginning, but had been overshadowed by the urgency of discovery and reconstruction. What could have prevented this? The warning signs had existed. Small deviations from routine, subtle changes in behavior, minor disturbances that, individually, seemed ordinary or explainable. Neighbors had noted unusual absences, fleeting moments of tension, minor disagreements that were dismissed as family stress or work pressures. Digital activity had shown irregularities, timestamps that did not align with expected behavior, small gaps in communication, patterns that could have raised concern if examined collectively. Yet those signs were either overlooked or interpreted as insignificant. Local authorities had received calls that hinted at potential distress, but none rose to a level requiring immediate intervention. Even within the household, interactions that might have suggested strain were subtle, internal, and easily concealed behind appearances of normalcy. The complexity of the family's routines and the private nature of their interactions created layers that obscured the trajectory of the eventual outcome. Systemic failures compounded the situation. Information was fragmented across agencies, departments, and digital platforms. Protocols for cross-checking behavior patterns or anomalies in domestic environments were limited. Digital records existed, but the connections between them were not immediately visible. Reports that might have been linked, analyzed collectively, or flagged for deeper review remained isolated, contributing to gaps in oversight. Missed intervention points became apparent during retrospective analysis. Had there been closer coordination between social services, law enforcement, and community observers, subtle signs might have been identified and assessed collectively. Had digital anomalies, messages sent or unsent, unusual logins, minor deviations from schedule, been reviewed alongside physical observations, earlier questions might have been raised. Small opportunities for engagement, contact, or support had existed. They were overlooked, underestimated, or assumed to be part of ordinary life. The emotional shift among those studying the case was significant. The investigation, once focused entirely on reconstruction and accountability, now carried an additional weight: the knowledge that earlier action might have altered the outcome. The timeline was reset in analysis once more, not to reinterpret the sequence of the event itself, but to identify moments where intervention could have occurred. The pattern of cause and effect became clearer. Subtle, incremental, almost imperceptible deviations built upon one another, creating a trajectory that went uncorrected. A contradiction emerged in reviewing these potential interventions. Some indicators had been present but lacked context. Other signals were clear but lacked the mechanisms for response. Both factors coexisted: observable warning signs and insufficient systemic response. Together, they illuminated the fragility of a framework intended to protect, yet limited in its capacity to act in complex, private situations. The lessons of the case extend beyond the specific circumstances of one household. They emphasize the importance of attentive observation, coordinated communication, and proactive assessment. They illustrate how minor deviations, when accumulated and unexamined, can precede events with profound consequences. They highlight gaps in systems that, even when functioning as designed, may fail to connect signals that, individually, seem inconsequential. Ultimately, the case serves as both caution and guide. It demonstrates that tragedy is rarely sudden. It is often preceded by subtle patterns of stress, absence, and imbalance. It confirms that timely observation, careful interpretation, and coordinated intervention can alter outcomes. And it underscores the responsibility of institutions, communities, and individuals to notice, to act, and to ensure that warning signs are not dismissed as ordinary life. The house, now silent, the family gone, and the timeline reconstructed, leaves behind a stark reminder. Understanding what occurred is vital. Acknowledging how it might have been prevented is equally essential. The lessons exist in the details, in the patterns, in the points where attention could have been applied. And they remain a guide for those who seek to prevent repetition of events where subtlety and human complexity intersect with consequence. Even as closure is reached, the value of reflection persists. The case is complete in its facts. Its outcomes are determined in courts and through accountability. But its lessons, measured and sober, endure far longer, demanding observation, care, and action wherever warning signs appear. The house, once filled with the rhythm of daily life, now stands empty. Rooms that had carried laughter, conversation, and routine remain silent. The objects that once defined ordinary moments, the chairs, the books, the toys, the small appliances humming quietly, persist as witnesses to absence. Not chaos, not spectacle, but presence transformed into emptiness, into stillness that carries meaning beyond what words can fully capture. In returning to the victims, the investigation shifts from reconstruction to remembrance. Each family member had routines, habits, and aspirations that shaped their lives and the lives of those around them. Neighbors recall casual greetings, small acts of kindness, moments of support. Friends speak of ordinary interactions, school pickups, shared meals, weekend projects. And yet, those interactions now carry weight, a sense of finality that was absent at the time. The public image of the family, once a mixture of perception and assumption, is replaced by the human realities of connection, emotion, and vulnerability. The family were not simply subjects of a case. They were people with histories, with hopes, with relationships that touched others in small but lasting ways. It is in these small human details that the emotional weight resides. The community, too, is shaped by the absence. Neighbors who once walked familiar paths with ease now move through streets that feel different, quieter, measured against memory. Local institutions, schools, social services, law enforcement reflect on their roles and on the points at which attention might have made a difference. The silence leaves space for reflection, for learning, for understanding the fragility of routine and the consequences when ordinary life intersects with deliberate action. Emotionally, the investigators themselves carry the weight. Months of review, repeated timeline resets, and the careful cataloging of movement and sequence leave traces. But the focus remains measured, restrained, factual. It is the facts that convey gravity, not exaggeration. It is the quiet observations, the contradictions, the moments of pause that hold the lasting impact. And yet, even in this stillness, one contradiction lingers. The absence of chaos does not erase the presence of consequence. The deliberate sequences, the measured pauses, the patterns of action, each speaks to the complexity of human behavior and the enduring consequences of choices made with intent. The timeline has been reconstructed, the evidence cataloged, the outcomes determined in law and procedure. But the weight of what occurred continues quietly, beyond documentation, beyond judgment. As the investigation closes, the focus returns entirely to reflection. On the family, on the impact, on the points where observation and intervention intersect with human behavior. The final reflection is sober. The truth has been reconstructed. The accountability has been applied. And yet, what remains is the quiet reminder that life is shaped by small, ordinary moments, and that absence, once it occurs, leaves a resonance that cannot be erased. The house stands still. The streets remain unchanged. But the memory of what transpired, the measure of consequence, the echoes of routines interrupted, persist in a way that calls for thought rather than fear, reflection rather than shock. And so the story ends where it began, in human life, in ordinary moments, in choices that carry weight beyond the immediate. The events are documented, the sequence understood, and the legal outcomes resolved. But the lessons remain, not as spectacle, but as sober truths, that attention matters, that action matters, and that human lives are defined as much by absence as by presence. The final line lingers in thought rather than in alarm. In the quiet that follows, what is left is a reminder to see, to act, and to remember, because the ordinary holds the weight of everything. Hi viewers, kindly subscribe to this channel if you enjoyed the story. Like, share, and hit the notification bell for more stories like this.